Hello everyone, thank you so much for coming. Um, I am very happy to be here in this session with Arunava because he doesn't know it, but I have long been wanting to pin him down to a conversation about his translation, and now I have him exactly where I want him. So I'm really looking forward to discussing translation with one of, particularly the Ingleji Bangla into English trajectory that Arunava follows. It's very unusual to have the same person being able to translate both ways. Usually as a translator, we expect that the language of translating into is your stronger language, and the language of origin, it's possible not to know it that way. And many translators operate on that basis. So it's really wonderful to have somebody who can, sort of with facility, do it both ways. You've already been told that this very young person who's sitting here next to me, young for those who haven't translated that, has already published 72 translators. I feel exhausted at the thought. But here he is with this vast repertoire of translations, and the fascinating thing about it is that these are all kinds of works. It's not that he's stuck to a particular kind of register within which he works. He's had humorous works, he's had absolutely high literature, literary fiction, is also poetry. And it's been works from across both borders in Bengal, works from Bangladesh, works from Canada. So there's this whole sort of panoply of things that he's done as a translator. And I'm hoping that we'll talk about some of the interesting moments, the challenges, the milestones, the funny things, the sad things that you've encountered along the way. So let's start by asking you, how did you get into this? When did it become your kind of realization that this was a calling of sorts?
So actually, I've asked this question of other translators around the world, and everybody has the same answer. They never know when they stepped over the threshold, as it were. I was interested in college because I realized after Gabriel Garcia Marquez won the Nobel Prize, for the first time, I think there was a realization that it was a work of translation that we were reading when we all picked up 100 Years of Solitude, which has become a sort of cult book from the time I think it came into English translation. And I started wondering what therefore went into it. And then when you look back, I was studying English literature at the time, and when you look back, you realize that a lot of the readings that you've done are actually works in translation. You never thought of it that way. You've always attributed all happy families are alike, all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. Leo Tolstoy to most of the world, but actually no. Actually, these are the words of Constance Garnett, who translated Tolstoy. But the translator is so invisible and transparent, as they're supposed to be, and yet so visible, because every word is theirs after all, the choice is always there. So it was quite an interesting realization, and I thought, what goes into it? And I tried my hand at it, and I discovered that it was really difficult.
Right, what was your first
This was just for fun. I used to just do small short passages for fun, but the first story that was published was in a city magazine that we used to bring out, so there was no editor to convince. There was, but the editor was also a friend. This was a short story by Shankar called Rickshawala. And that was my first translation, and I quite cringe at it when I see it.
Really?
Yeah.
Does that happen to you a lot, or you look back and you want to change?
All the time, and you don't have to look back very far. If I look at last month's work, I cringe.
So you started with Shankar, and you've also done his memoirs recently.
Yes. So on the basis of that story, he then said, would you like to translate my novel Chowringhee, which a French publisher is looking to publish and wants to read in English. So this was not even meant for publication at the time. Then I translated it and I gave it to him, and I left Calcutta soon after for Delhi, for a new job in Delhi, which was in journalism. and had nothing to do with translation, except occasionally, once every 2 years or so, I'd feel, oh, I am going to be a translator one day. So then I would translate a para here and a para there from some novel or the other. But it was actually 14 years after I turned in that translation that an editor from Penguin, Diakot, called me and said, we want to publish Chowringhee, and the writer says that there already is a translation, he's forgotten the translator's name, but he sent the manuscript, what you had given him, a printout, computer printout, and it has this name, so are you the person? So that it came at the right time, and Anjum, I'm far from young, and I was far from young then, so it came just at the right time to avoid a midlife crisis, because otherwise I'd have done something very silly. So translation became my red Ferrari, and that was how that whole thing began.
Translation became my red Ferrari. Now you know why he's a good translator, right? He has these wonderful quotable quotes at the drop of a hat. Right, so you started with your very first story, as you said, was a shocker story. Do you remember that experience at all? Was there anything in that experience that sort of has stayed with you as a lesson in translation, or that you have found that you reject now?
Well, two things. One, of course, is that reading that story, and I was actually young then. Reading that story made it very clear that, writers know what they're doing. And as a translator, you don't have to mess with that text. Sometimes some translators feel that they can do better than the writers, or that something needs fixing, changing. It was very clear to me that nothing needs fixing, changing. Just stick with the text. They know what they're doing. That was one. The other thing was also a sense of absolute inability to, a realization that I was incapable of writing anything of my own. And therefore, all the more reason to ensure fidelity in translation. So that became my guideline. What has changed over the years is what fidelity means.
Okay.
At that point, fidelity used to be, go with every word and try to put it in English. It must read like it's in English, but nevertheless go with every word and focus on that. Since then, I've stepped back a bit and realized that there are 20 other things that go into a text. It's not just the meaning of each word and sentence. We're also talking about rhythms, music, silence, allusions, little nods to things here and there. So those are things I've learned. I think every translator learns as they go.
Right, so that sounds like a hardcore literary education, reading text,
It really is. I mean, I'd argue that translators read text more closely than anybody else on earth.
Right. In fact, that's what Gayatri Spivak says about Mahashita Devi. So because when she was translating, she said the closeness with which I had to read that text was, I don't think any other reader does. Right. So one of the things you have talked about very importantly is the fact that your stance is that as a translator, you don't fiddle with the text in terms of stylistics, in terms of how the writer has tried to convey whatever they are writing about, right? And the other thing is that you've also realized that it's a very holistic approach where you have not just the meaning, but also the impression and the feeling and the atmosphere and all these intangibles to try and recreate. So, recently, not very recently, but over, I would say, the last 15 years maybe, translation studies has come into its own. With a lot of philosophy involved, with a lot of theory involved as to what is a transparent translator, how much do you include in the text. Where do you stand on this spectrum? I mean, what are your do's and don'ts?
No, do you mean spectrum meaning what do I think of translation theory and studies?
Yeah, all the various theories that exist.
Right.
Where would you...
Right. So most translation theory is not about the practice, but about ways in which translations can be interpreted. So to begin with, they assume that the translation is a separate work and therefore needs its own analysis, criticism, studies, and so on, which I think might be fine if you're looking at it from an academic point of view, but that is not the real raison d'etre of the translation, right? It is there because somebody wants to read Rabindranath or Garcia Marquez or Tolstoy or Murakami and doesn't know the language in which they don't. So it's a very practical reason for which the translation exists. And therefore from there any theory that you can then extract is useful for thinking about it. And sometimes you say, oh wow, I never thought of that before. And sometimes they actually help you rationalize some decisions. One of the things I can think of is when Walter Benjamin in his famous essay on translation, which was actually an introduction to his own translations of work, and which ironically turned out to have been mistranslated in parts into English. And we have all read that mistranslation and drawn our conclusions about what Benjamin thought. It turns out that the original was somewhat different. But anyway, one of the points he makes is in his usual metaphorical, colorful way, which is that translation is about dressing a person in a different set of clothes. They're not the same set of clothes they were wearing to begin with. You remove them and you put a different set of clothes on them. So
the person essentially remains the same.
Yes, and that led me to think that the person exists without the clothes. They're always there. Now, no matter what clothes you put on them, the person exists outside of the clothes. And so I started thinking, does the text then exist outside of the language? And therefore, can we then stop wringing our hands over what's lost in translation? Because the first thing you hear whenever there's any discussion on translation is people bemoaning all the things that cannot be taken from one language to the other, right? Especially when it comes to Bangla, it's all about the onomatopoeic sounds and so on. So, if the text is so closely wedded to the language in which it is written that you cannot separate the two, then all translation is doomed to fail. It cannot exist in another form. It's the skin. If you take you can do a skin graft, but it's a dicey proposition. On the other hand, if the language is closed, then you can indeed think rationally about, fine, I will put on a different set of clothes on this person. It'll still be the same person, looking different. But it kind of settles your mind. You're then not anxious about doing violence to the text in the process. So this kind of theoretical thinking actually helps a translator if they want to stop and think about it. But it does not help them in terms of deciding how to translate. I think that provides, until you sleep at night. If you know what I mean. Without feeling that you've done some horrible damage to the
So you just brought up the subject of how from Bangla to English there's always a sense of bemoaning loss, right? And you work from Bangla to English. So where for you, can you talk a little bit about that, about what are the things that you've had to compromise on or maybe just enjoy?
Yeah, well, I don't know if compromise is the right word. I would just say find a different solution, as it were. For example, one classic thing is the use of various registers of Bangla, including geographical and regional and historical dialects. What do you do when you take them into English? Because if you create some kind of artificial dialect, then it clearly doesn't read well. On the other hand, if you adopt a ready-made dialect, then you are geographically subtly locating someone who's speaking, let's say, in the dialect, in the local terms in Birbhum. If you suddenly make them speak, say, Cockney English or American Street, it's ridiculous. It's not going to work, right? So this is where instead of giving up and you're saying, okay, this can't be done, then you say, fine, it can't be done. So then let's see what can be done. And then the thinking is that even when people are speaking in a particular version of a language, they are perfectly comprehensible to one another. And they're not thinking of themselves as speaking in a distorted version or a lower version or anything. It's actually we urbanites and Calcuttans in particular, if you look at the history of Bangla, which has claimed this preeminent position for the Bangla of Kolkata, which has become the standard version, as it were, which of course has been challenged in Bangladesh, but then there too there is a standard version. So if we are then going to say standard version goes to standard version and then non-standard versions go to non-standard versions of the language into which you translate, then you're in a mess. It's not going to work, right? So you try other things. You play with the vocabulary, you play with the length of sentences. You just try to create some differences in register.
The syntax of the sentence.
Yes, but you do not break grammar and spelling, for example, which I've seen done, because then you're doing a disservice. Then you're saying that, oh, these people don't speak, they don't know how to speak the language, they're mangling it. That's completely wrong.
No, you hit on one of the most difficult and sensitive issues actually. Because when one is reading the text in Bangla, without being nudged in any way, you've already understood a class background or a geographical background of this person. without it being hit on the head that look, this person is a migrant from East Bengal, etc. So, and that is very difficult to capture without elaborate notes in English. Would you like to read something at this point?
All right, I'm going to read the opening passage of a novel that I found particularly difficult but therefore particularly exhilarating to translate. This is Khwabnama, written by Akhtaruzzaman Ilyas, who was from Bangladesh. And it was often considered, in fact the translation has been, many people in Bangladesh are very, very unhappy about the fact that the book's been translated, and they feel that no translation, I mean nothing personal, no translation can do justice to this text, and that it should remain in Bangla forever, which is a feeling that many custodians of Rabindranath's works had for a long time, and forever kept him imprisoned, which who did it help really? So this is the opening passage. The spot where Tamiz's father stood with his feet planted in the mud, craning his neck as high as possible, stretching his nerves taut, and waving his jet black arms to dispel the grey clouds, needs to be noted carefully. A long time ago, when leave alone Tamiz's father, even his father had not been born, when his grandfather Baghar Maji's birth was still a long way in the future, when Baghar Maji's grandfather's father, or was it his grandfather, had barely been born, or not, and even if he had, was only crawling about on the newly laid earth in the home built by clearing a part of the forest. On one afternoon during those days, while he was speeding towards the Kartuha river to visit the Mohastan Killa with several of Majnu Shah's fakirs, Munshi Barkatullah Shah was flung from his horse after being shot dead by Taylor, the commander of the British troops. The hole left in his neck by the bullet was never filled. After his death, with a chain around this neck and his body smeared with ash, and holding an iron pan with fish motifs carved on it, he perched on the fig tree on the northern side of the Katlahar lake. Ever since then, he became the sunlight during the day and spread himself all over the lake and rained over the lake all night from the fig tree. Tamiz's father waved his arms to get rid of the clouds in the sky in the hope of catching a glimpse of Munshi, which was all very well. But 2 or 2.25 years from now, or maybe 2.5, or even 3, after drowning to death in the quicksand in one corner of the bank recently sprung from the receding waters of the lake, where would Tamiz's father surface? Who was going to make room for him? And so on.
Wow. So, I mean, I could point to some of the difficulties I can perceive, but as a translator, what did you...
Well, the length, of course, as you could make out, the sentence ran on almost interminably. And yet it has, when you read the Bangla, it runs on, but there is no problem understanding what's going on there. So you have to ensure that it is as clear. At the same time, you can't do disservice to the writer's intent by breaking up that sentence for the sake of easy understanding. Then you're reading somebody else, you're no longer reading Elias. And of course, because this is the opening passage, it sets the tone for the entire novel, which runs some 700 pages. So you have to be very, very sure that you've got it right, because this will set the mood and everything for what comes afterwards. But you know, the interesting thing is, and Anjum, you're a translator, you know this as well, which is that well-written text translates itself. There is something very innately musical and right about it that allows you to put it into a different language, that take off the shirt and put on a new shirt happens easily. And it's only badly written text that you struggle to translate.
Yeah. But sometimes to respond to that also the nervousness of not somehow doing injustice to the beauty of that text. Sort of keeping the complexities and the rhythm, it leaves you feeling quite sort of,
Yeah. So sometimes it's translating is more of a mechanical process than the writing of the first version of the text. I mean, I dare say Akhtaruzzaman Ilyas sat and just wrote that sentence at one go. Whereas as a translator, you break it up, you translate the bits, then you reassemble them, and then hope that that is working seamlessly so that it feels like one full sentence.
So just like this particular text that you honed in on, which has a very strong personality of its own. I was thinking of Faulkner, I was thinking of Joyce. I was wondering if he'd been reading them at some point before it started.
Yes.
So just like that, are there other particular moments that you can pick up on where you found something interesting, intriguing, different, and you figured out a way of tackling it in the course of all your work?
So this happens mostly, one of the times it happens a great deal is when you're translating something you live with from for a long time, maybe from childhood, which was the case for me with Hojaborolo, Shukumar Rai Hojaborolo, and also Shibram Chakravarti stories. So with Shibram stories it was interesting because, as you know, his prose is largely wordplay. So he's got a pun, every now and then, every two para, and maybe sometimes every sentence he's got a pun. And first you have to read very closely to make sure you identify and get the pun. And then you are completely in a cul-de-sac, because how are you going to translate each and every pun into something that still makes sense? This is where I remember reading an interview with Anita Bell, who for my money is the greatest translator, well, maybe joint, as they say in Bangla, bracket it first, with Gregory Rabasa. But Anita Bell not only translated some of the finest literary writers of Europe, who wrote in French and German, including Cheval, but she also translated till her death all the Asterix comics. She put down there as a co-translator, but she is the actual translator. Her co-translator was a technical consultant. So what Anita Bell said was that I would count the number of puns on each page, and I would make sure my translation had the same number of puns, but not necessarily the same puns, or translate the puns themselves. So this is a classic case of a transparent and yet completely present translator, because all of us who read Asterix in English and laugh at all the jokes, they are not Goskini's jokes, they are actually Anita Bell's jokes. So I tried the same thing when it came to Shibram Chakravarti. I said, if this para has 3 puns, I'm going to make 3 puns. So while the meaning I will keep the same, I will introduce the puns elsewhere where they flow more naturally. And equally the same thing happened with Hojaborolo, because Hojaborolo, of course, this is one book I was terrified of. Not because of the quality of the text, but because will people laugh the same way that I laughed when I read it. And of course, one of the most interesting parts of it was the nonsense rhymes, which Shukanto Chaudhuri has translated so brilliantly when he translated Abul Tabul. But in Hojaborolo, there's a lot of songs and rhymes that he uses. So I'm maybe just going to read a little bit where Nara শুরু করেছে যে না ভাই এখন আমায় গাইতে বলো না, আজকে আমার গলা তেমন খুলবে না। তো বলে বলছি কে তোমায় গান গাইতে বলেছে? তারপরে নারা says রাগ করলে, হ্যাঁ ভাই রাগ করলে, আচ্ছা না হয় কয়েকটা গান শুনিয়ে দিচ্ছি, রাগ করবার দরকার কি ভাই? And then he starts singing. So he starts with he just starts with lines. Red song, blue tune, the smiling kind of smell. He sang that one line once, twice, 5 times, 10 times. I said, this is grating on my nerves. Doesn't your song have any other lines? Shaven had replied, it does, but that's a different song. That one goes, dancing down the lane, pavement food is plain, whitewashed with rain. I do not sing it these days. There's another one, Tender Nuts from Nainital. You have to sing it very mildly. I cannot sing this one either at present. The one that I do sing is the Shifty Shark song. Misty marks and shifty sharks all whisper to the sky, silly bottles, hilly cabs, voices running high, easy-going slanted light on lisping afternoons, thin and thick and black and white crooning shadow tunes. Now if you remember, but the Bangla, this is not exactly a translation of the Bangla poem. It's Mishi Maka Shishi Paka Akashe Kane Kane Shishi Botol Chipi Daka Shodu Shodu Gane Gane. Right, so this is where I thought I'm going to make up my own nonsense rhyme using as many of the elements of that original thing as possible. But to me, fidelity here was the rhythm and the rhyme.
Right.
And in order to keep the rhythm and the rhyme, I played a bit with the content. I just made sure that bottles and bottle caps and everything, they were all present in the translation. So similarly, there's a very famous song, Badur bole ore hoai sajaru ajke rate dekhbe ekta mojaru, which Satyajit Ray then also immortalized in Jayadeva Bhelunath. So he says, do you suppose I'm incapable of singing simple ditties? He began. The bat said to his friend the hedgehog, tonight I will show you a ledge dog. I interrupted him, there's no such word as ledge dog. Shaven had said, why ever not? There certainly is. If you can have hedgehog or sledge frog or dredge bog, then why not ledge dog? The goat said, let the song go on, meanwhile we can see about the word later. At once Shaven had resumed his singing. The bat said to his friend the hedgehog, tonight I will show you a ledge dog. You will see the owls and insects fly. Around us the poor mouse will die. Murbi Durvachara. Frogs and tadpoles will just sweat in fright, with teeth that chattered in fear through the night. Skunks will run with tails between their legs, and you will see the chimbi chango kegs. I was about to object again, but I stopped myself. The song continued. The hedgehog said, "Did you see or not the missus sleeping underneath the pot? A warning for the owl and owless, shut up. If their hooting wakes the missus up, I will poke them till they're full of holes. This is something they must be told." The bat said, "If you ask the owl's family, none of them will accept your family." And so on. So the whole thing was then you start having fun with it at one point, and you realize that probably Chakravarti was also making up the poems, having fun with the words, and that exact content didn't matter as long as it was all absurd.
Right. Yeah.
So this is the farthest I've strayed from the text, as it were, when translating. But I felt that this, to my mind, this is fidelity, rather than creating something very lifeless by sticking
to the exact.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you've talked so far about translating from Bangla to Veda.
Okay, so this is interesting because, like many of us, we all speak Bangla, use Bangla every day, but we don't write Bangla. And after I've done a number of translations into English, I really felt the need to push the envelope because you want to try new things and you want to see if you're any good at it. So I picked a text that was a very well-known text in India, Bhachar Gochar, Vivek Shanbag's text, and although it was not, it's written in Kannada, which I don't have, but both he and the publisher agreed to my using an English and a Hindi translation as references. So I used those to create a Bangla, and because it felt a very direct, unadorned kind of, but very nuanced kind of text in both those languages, I felt that this is something that I might be able to pull off because it's fairly direct and it's contemporary, so the vocabulary doesn't go back many years and so on. And then I discovered something really interesting, which is that I couldn't write. I was unable to write out the translation on the keyboard. Then I started translating orally and recording it, and it just fell into place. So I realized that being used to speaking in Bangla, it was actually easier to construct the sentences as though I'm speaking them. And I also discovered that when you speak, you unlock a very different side of your brain perhaps, and a very different vocabulary. Words that would not spring to my mind if I sat down at a keyboard were just jumping up, popping up because I was using them in everyday speech. So that's how I now do the Bangla, in the sense that I speak it out in my head and then I type it out.
Yeah. And apart from this one technique that you've come to, is there anything else, like, you struggle with certain things when you're putting it into English? Like, for example, you were talking about onomatopoeic sounds. Then there's the other big thing that usually happens is that the emotional kind of nuances in Bangla either become too purple in English or too dry. So when you were doing it the other way around, did you face any such sort of?
Well, so far all three texts I've translated are by Indians. So they although I used the English versions, or they wrote in English. One, Amitabh Ghosh wrote Gun Island in English, but the sensibilities are not necessarily Western. So I don't know how that will go. I did try translating a poem by Shameless into Bangla.
Have you got both versions?
I don't have but I can look it up. Or let me read a poem by Joy Harjo, who was the poet laureate in English. I'll read the Bangla first and then look up the name. হয়তো দুনিয়া এখানেই শেষ হয়। দুনিয়া শুরু রান্নাঘরের টেবিলে। যাই হোক না কেন, বাঁচতে হলে খেতে হবে। পৃথিবীর উপহারগুলো এনে প্রস্তুত করে টেবিলে রাখা হয়। সৃষ্টির গোড়া থেকেই এরকম চলবেও। কুকুর মুরগি এলে টেবিল থেকে তাড়িয়ে দিই। শিশুরা টেবিলের কোনায় দাঁত বসায়, টেবিলের তলায় ওদের হাঁটু ছড়ে যায়। এই টেবিলেই ওরা নির্দেশ পায় মানুষ হওয়া মানে কি। আমরা পুরুষ তৈরি করি এখানেই, মহিলা তৈরি করি। টেবিলের চারপাশে বসে গল্প করি, শত্রুদের কথা মনে পড়ে, প্রেমিক প্রেমিকাদের মূর্তির কথাও। এখানেই আমাদের স্বপ্নগুলো আমাদের সঙ্গে কফি খেতে খেতে আমাদের ছেলে মেয়েদের জড়িয়ে ধরে। আমরা যখন নিজেদের পড়ে যাওয়া নিয়ে হাসি, যখন হাসতে হাসতে আবার মেরামত করে নিই নিজেদের, ওরাও আমাদের সঙ্গে হাসে। এই টেবিলটা বৃষ্টিতে ছাদ, রোদে ছাতা। মহাযুদ্ধ শুরু ও শেষ দুটোই হয়েছে এই টেবিলে। আতঙ্কের ছায়ায় লুকোনোর জায়গা এটা, ভয়ঙ্কর বিজয় উদযাপন করারও। এই টেবিলে আমরা জন্ম দিয়েছি, বাবা মাকে প্রস্তুত করেছি কবর দিতে। আনন্দের গান গাই এখানে, দুঃখেরও। কষ্ট ও অনুতাপ আমাদের প্রার্থনার বিষয়, কৃতজ্ঞতা জানাই এখানেই। হয়তো দুনিয়া এই রান্নাঘরের টেবিলেই শেষ হয়ে যাবে আমাদের কান্না হাসির মাঝখানে মিষ্টিতে শেষ কামড়টা দিতে দিতে। Let me see if I can quickly look
that
at
particular thing that Mishtite Chhat or Rode Chhata, that was that kind of play of words.
So sometimes, the language allows some things. I never tired of giving this example. When Rabindranath translated T.S. Eliot's Journey of the Magi, and if you read the translation, you wouldn't believe it was Rabindranath, because he was using words and expressions that you will not encounter in his poetry. A very, very modern idiom. And the last line of Journey of the Magi is, I should be glad of another death. And Rabindranath took that line and turned it into Arekbar morte parle ami bachi. And he just, I mean, I suppose in a sense only a poet can do that, and others would. Let me see if I can find the poem. Sorry, excuse me a moment. If you want to ask your next question.
No, I was just going to, since we started talking about poetry, and I don't know how.
Sorry, I found it.
Good.
Perhaps the world ends here. The world begins at a kitchen table. No matter what, we must eat to live. The gifts of earth are bought and prepared, set on the table. So it has been since creation, and it will go on. We chase chickens or dogs away from it. Babies teeth at the corners. They scrape their knees under it. It is here that children are given instructions on what it means to be human. We make men at it. We make women. At this table we gossip, recall enemies and the ghosts of lovers. Our dreams drink coffee with us as they put their arms around our children. They laugh with us at our poor falling down selves, and as we put ourselves back together once again at the table. The table has been a house in the rain, an umbrella in the sun. Wars have begun and ended at this table. It is a place to hide in the shadow of terror, a place to celebrate the terrible victory. We have given birth on this table and have prepared our parents for burial here. At this table we sing with joy, with sorrow. We pray of suffering and remorse. We give thanks. Perhaps the world will end at the kitchen table while we are laughing and crying, eating of the last sweet bite.
Dare I say that your translation of the Mishti Chhat and Chhata sounds better? Yeah. So I was going to ask you about translating poetry. What are the special challenges and rewards of that? And in the context of the fact that maybe some of you have seen the exhibition at Shila of Nilanjan Bandyopadhyay's poems and haiku drawings or paintings, and those translations are done by Arunava. So you don't have to specifically talk about those or read those if you don't want to, but just talking about being a translator from poetry, of poetry in the two languages.
So Nilanjan's poems are actually a very good example because, his poems are very much like his. Actually, you should really see the exhibition if you haven't. And please do watch the short video that's part of the exhibition, because there's a brilliant glimpse there of how he makes those calligraphy canvases. And he does them in a moment, in a flash, an entire canvas which has his interpretation of a word or two of Bangla. He uses the Bangla script, but he does it in the Japanese calligraphic style, and he does it in one sweep, one continuous movement. It's almost like he got a bhor koreche, sei murte jokhono korche. It's not as though he's thinking it through and doing it very cerebrally. And his poems are very much like that. They're just a moment, like the classic haiku. They're just a moment caught, and a moment where a visual combines with a thought. And they come together, and a very simple idea, and yet suddenly acquires, it moves from being tried to being sounding really profound, or at least deep. So his poems are those. They are what you might call minimalist. And last evening we had dinner with him, and one of the things he pointed out about minimalism, and this actually applies to poetry translation, which is that minimalism is not about saying that I can do with only 5 things or 10 things, but about saying what is the most I can get out of the 5 or 10 things I have. How can my 5 or 10 things literally become 50 things? But I don't need to add another 45 for it. And then I thought, wow, that really is poetry. It is so charged, it is just a few words. And you, as a translator, you cannot go and get words from anywhere else. You are a minimalist in theory because you have to use those very words. That's all you have. And yet you have to get the most beauty and the most meaning. As Ezra said, poetry is nothing but language charged to the utmost with meaning. And while Ezra had a lot of fascist leanings, he had good ideas about poetry. And of course, he was instrumental in taking Rabindranath's work to the world as well, along with Yeats. So that for me is translation of poetry, where you only have those words and you have to do something with them. Maybe you will create a new set, of course you will create a new set of words because it's a different language. But the poetry resides in the words and everything that they will then evoke and invoke and so on. You have to be really minimalist. You can't say, Banglar ei line ta to ami ek line e porte parbo na, amake to du line kortei hobe. You cannot do it. If it's one line there, it's got to be one line in your translation. And vice versa, into Bangla as well. And then you see what is the best way you can do it. And there are methods. I mean, I can't tell you what methods. Sometimes lines pop up in your head. You know, sometimes the entire line you're playing with the original and suddenly the entire line will turn up. At other times, you're taking each word and you're like a jigsaw puzzle, you're putting them together. As I said, it's almost an act of engineering sometimes. And yet what you're creating is obviously not engineering in that sense. So poetry is a truly fascinating and enormously, but also incredibly rewarding effort.
Why rewarding so much?
Rewarding because I think great poetry can make you feel so much more as a reader than the finest novel or work of fiction can. So it's very rewarding to be able to see those words right there. Yeah, I mean, I've of late, every now and then, I translate the poems of Binoy Majumdar, which is not for publication, or not as yet anyway. Binoy Majumdar was, he was, I don't know how many things he was diagnosed with, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder and so on. And sometimes, I think anyone who is involved with words sees themselves in such a figure. And you always see that's me. Swinging between extremes and so on, and not having a very good grip on reality all the time. So his poetry is very bizarre because he's talking about the distance between the sun and the earth and the moon and which way the shadows fall. And you think, how is this poetry even? Till you start, it's like a food that you see and you think, what the hell is this? Then you start eating it and you say, my God, what the hell is this?
Yeah.
So it's a bit like.
Can you read us something for
Wait, I don't have anything right now, I'm afraid. Sorry.
No, but you were saying you have been translating this.
Yes, I don't think I have anything.
No, that's right. But we hope that.
No, hang on, maybe I might, if you give me a minute. Actually, I might be able to find it. Yes. I just remembered
How many of you know Binoy Majumdar's poetry?
Unfortunately, বাংলাটা এখন আমার কাছে নেই, কিন্তু আমি just একটা পড়ছি, একটা দুটো, to give you a sense of what it was like. In my garden there are 75 coconut trees. So I have managed to research coconut trees for a long time. Each coconut holds a glass of juice, and in a year each tree grows 50 coconuts, so 50 glasses of juice are what we get from the top of every coconut tree. So much juice can rise 20 or 30 yards without a pump. I have held detailed discussions about this with my fellow villagers since a long time. And then here's another one. Larger than the sun. There are stars larger than the sun, still they seem smaller. All the stars that are distant appear to be small. All the stars that are closer appear to be large. Such are my thoughts when gazing at the sky at night. It's the month of July, darkness has fallen. I saw the crescent moon set behind the row of coconut trees. I sit in the moonlight when the moon rises. I lie in it because the touch of moonlight is beneficial to my body.
So there's a prose-like quality to the way he writes
Yes.
it, that the thoughts and the imagery and things are true
Yes.
to it.
Yes, exactly.
Right. So before we open this up to questions, and I hope you will think of one or two things you'd like to ask before we have to release Sorunavo from our midst. Can you let's talk a little bit about, what you would very roughly or broadly call the politics of translation. But you were also talking outside about how, Bangla literature, what has been translated, what is reaching the world. How do you feel as a very active participant in this process? What are your thoughts on what's going on and what needs to be done?
So this is interesting. At the Ashoka Centre for Translation, which is located in Ashoka University, we've started a project to start compiling a catalogue of works translated into, to begin with, works translated from various non-English Indian languages into English. And so far we've got about 5,000 titles catalogued there, and we find that full 20% of them are Bangla titles. So nearly 1,000 of them, which is by far away the largest number of books to be translated from any language. And yet, in Kolkata, I find that this happened interesting when Gitanjali Shri won the Booker International, when there was suddenly TV stations and a few newspapers started this anguished cry of, why doesn't the Bangla book win the Booker Prize? And immediately some people jumped up to say the translations are very bad, there are not enough translations, this is why no one gets to know. Usual kind of lamentation and hand-wringing that began. So I just realized that there is no awareness of the fact that as many as 1,000 works of Bangla have been translated into English. And they cover really the range, right from the canon right down to modern and contemporary works. Initially, when Indian publishers or publishers in India started publishing translated literature, a lot of it was in Bangla for two reasons. One was that many of the editors were Bengalis, so they naturally turned to the language that they knew. And the second is that, as far as the canon is concerned, Bengali writing actually has a reputation. I mean, if you ask anyone to name 10 Indian writers, classic Indian writers, 5 of them will turn out to be Bengali, because that is how it rests in the popular imagination. And back in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, Bangla literature was perhaps the most widely read literature in India in different Indian languages. In Kerala, there are people who are actually called Sharat Chandra and Bankim Chandra after the writers, without their having any idea that those writers were not locals. They actually thought they were Malayali writers. Likewise, Sharat Chandra and not Rabindranath is the most translated and most popular writer in Hindi. So there was a very robust tradition of translating Bangla literature into other Indian languages. So many people have grown up reading Bangla literature without knowing that it's Bangla sometimes. And then when English publishing began, publishing translation, same thing happened. So Bangla actually has a sort of place of preeminence when it comes to the number of books, and because it's such a large number, most of them are of really good books, because the books that were chosen as books that have already found a place for themselves in the Bangla canon and or were also very popular and so on. So that of course has been the past mostly. But as with other languages, as also with Bangla now, finally there are authors from the fringes who are beginning to be published and read because of two reasons. One is that the internet has done a lot for them. And secondly, there are many small publishers now with excellent production qualities who are able to bring these previously marginalized writers into the mainstream of distribution and book selling and so on. And so a number of them are now beginning to be translated as well. So people like Manoranjan Bapari, Adhir Bishas, so many Dalit writers, Manoranjan Bapari and Adhir Bishas are two. There is Kalyani Thakur Charal. Kalyani Thakur Charal's poetry in translation is being published by Tilted Axis Press in the UK, which is the same press that published Tomb of Sand that won the International Booker. So a lot of interest now in voices that have not been heard as powerfully as the equivalent of the dead white men that Bangla literature also had. And when you look back and look at it dispassionately, you will see that those were actually ruled by things like Ke Bhadralok Noy, and Bhadralok inevitably mapped onto the upper caste. মানে সবাই বাংলা সাহিত্য নিয়ে বলে তিন বালুরচে না, তারাশঙ্কর, বিভূতিভূষণ আর মানিক বন্দ্যোপাধ্যায়, তারাশঙ্কর বন্দ্যোপাধ্যায়, বিভূতিভূষণ বন্দ্যোপাধ্যায়, তিনজনেরই পদবী কিন্তু বন্দ্যোপাধ্যায় কিন্তু ব্রাহ্মণ পদবী. So if you really look at it, it's really the upper caste writers also who may not have worn their caste on their sleeves, but nevertheless it was a natural pass to being published and succeeding. So I think that is also beginning to change, and translation can play a big role there.
Yeah.
It's enabling some writers like Kolani Chakravarti, let's say, or Avi Bishop to leapfrog the local market and go straight into a national or an international leadership.
Okay, thank you. So is there anybody who has a question?
There's a lady here.
Yes? Oh, sorry. Yes, Anjum.
Thank you, that was wonderful. I was wondering whether you see any virtue in, well, if it's okay, do I need to speak into the microphone? I will say too. So, thanks so much. A, do you see any virtue in 2 or more translations putting their heads together? I mean, do you see that as a possibility? Or is translation mostly a kind of a solitary art and science? And the other one, because you've covered such a wide, staggeringly wide spectrum of writers, I was thinking on the other side of the spectrum, say of somebody like Anne Goldstein, who's all about Elena Ferrante. She's known only for Elena Ferrante translations. Some of that would be true about Constance Garnett too, I believe. So, what is that like to be, to live through one writer or one poet across a lifetime?
So yes, I can't speak for them, but of course, the interesting thing is that we have come to associate them with one writer. But as it happened, Anne Goldstein, for example, is also the translator of another brilliant Italian writer named Alessandro Berico, whose works are magnificent. But of course, it's Ferrante that has propelled her to fame. I don't think the translators mind very much. They're happy to be known as the voices of certain writers. I'm sure Gregory Rabassa quite liked being Gabriel Garcia Marquez in English, although there was another translator as well. Similarly, for example, yes, Anthea Belfort, yes, reads comics. So I think there's a certain affinity that grows between a translator and a writer. So J. Rubin for Murakami. But interestingly, the translators' names are probably only remembered by a very small percentage of readers. And that's not, I don't see anything wrong with that. That's fine. You're not reading Anne Goldstein. You're picking up the book because it's Elena Ferrante. And if you don't remember Anne Goldstein, it means she's done a job well. You have suspended your disbelief to believe that you have read the words that Elena Ferrante wrote, although she did not write them in English.
Yeah.
Interestingly, this is an aside, which is that Jhumpa Lahiri, who wrote a novel in Italian, did not translate it into English herself, and it was Anne Goldstein who translated her. So I wonder if someday she will also be known as Jhumpa Lahiri's English voice, which is an irony given that Jhumpa Lahiri is known for her English language. So that can get really interesting. But Gregory Rabassa also very brilliantly translated Julio Cortázar. And in fact, the story is that it was Julio Cortázar who told Gregory Rabassa, yes. So Gabriel Garcia Marquez wanted 100 Years of Solitude to be translated into English and went to his friend Julio Cortázar and said, whom should I ask? And Julio Cortázar said, go to Gregory Rabassa. So he went to Gregory Rabassa. Rabassa said, I'm very busy. I'm translating Julio Cortázar. so Garcia Marquez went back to Cortázar and said, now what? Cortázar said, wait. So he waited, and then Gabriel Garcia Marquez finally went to Gregory Rabassa, who then said, having given my word, I will translate it. And he translated it without having read a word of 100 Years of Solitude. He translated it because Julio Cortázar told him, you must. And he read that book as he was translating it. Can you imagine that?
Yeah.
Can you imagine? And yet sometimes, I'll tell you, you can make better magic that way. If by some means you know that this is a book that should be translated and you have not read a word of that book, it does not matter. Because the magic that you will get in reading it and writing it, reading it and writing it will be so much more than when you already read and internalized the text. Because that is when you may start putting in things of your own without realizing it. But because you're encountering the text for the first time, you have no notions about it at all. You can't inject anything of your own. You can only translate what you're reading. And Rabassa always said, I am led by the text. I am led by the text. I mean, he had such a simple answer. He has a beautiful autobiography memoir called If This Be Treason, where he plays on that Italian pun, where the similar sounding words for translator and traitor. Traditore, traducer, yeah. And then of course there is that horrible sexist joke which you hear all the time. about her translation is like a woman. She can either be beautiful or she can be faithful. She can't be both. Yeah, exactly. And it's often repeated with great merriment. But there it is.
The first part of your question.
Yes, sorry.
About
Yeah, I think it's a great idea, especially when you want to go between languages where there are very few translators who know both languages. So there is a husband and wife couple who are still married, who have translated Tolstoy and Dostoevsky mainly, they've done modern translations from Russian to English, and she is the native Russian speaker and he is the native English speaker. So she does the first draft, then he uses her draft to do a second draft, and then their final method is, and this is where I don't know how they've survived this, they sit facing each other and she reads the Russian paragraph in the Russian and he reads it in the final English, and then they say, yeah, sign off on this para and so on. They're very much in love with each other, they could not have survived this otherwise. But it would be a great way, and it is something that we are actually at the Ashoka Centre, we are actually going to experiment with this year. Because we find that, yeah, because for example, if you want to take Malayalam into Bangla, you can't. There is no translator who will do it. And I just heard, I was in Trivandrum and I just heard about a Malayali who was so enamored of Bangla literature that he learned Bangla. He came to Kolkata, he learned Bangla, and then like Constance Garnett, he translated a stream of Bengali books into Malayalam.
Have you ever translated anything by being led by the text like that?
All the time. That's all I do. Fortunately, I have no literary pretensions, so I do not claim to understand anything. And sometimes people talk about text, and I'm like, really? Wow, I didn't know that. And then they'll use a translation that I've done and they'll say, I knew that.
Okay, I think we can bring this, unless there's another question from the floor. No? So we bring this session to a close. Thank you very much, Arunava. That was
Thank you.
particularly, I mean, I enjoyed it. I
Thank you so much.
So thank you very much. And may you go on to do another 72.
No, please.
More red Ferraris.
No. But there are many excellent young translators now all across India. And translation comes very naturally to Indians. So we are very excited about that.
This is all coming out at the Ashoka Centre.
Yes, we've got 6 students whose translations are being published by the Penguins and the HarperCollins, and they're all around 20 years of age.
Wow, that's something heartening for the future. Thank you very much for being such a wonderful audience. Thank you very much.